This is a podcast by the Straits Times.
New rules for personal mobility aids, or PMAs, have officially kicked in from June 1st. If you're under 70 and riding a mobility scooter, you now need a certificate of medical need, and speeds have been slashed to 6 kilometers per hour. These rules were introduced after years of pedestrians brushing shoulders with PMAs and other active mobility devices on our paths. But instead of squeezing pedestrians and riders onto tiny pavements, could we reclaim our car lanes to build a true sweat-free transport network for our first and last mile commutes? Hello, I'm Lynda Hong, Assistant Podcast Editor of the Straits Times. Welcome to In Your Opinion. In this episode, I'm joined by Associate Professor Yap Fook Fah, Director from the Transport Centre at NTU, to discuss how we can improve active mobility. Welcome to the show, Professor.
Hi, Lynda. Thanks for having me.
Okay, Prof. In recent years, we've seen many classifications of active mobility devices. You have PMAs, you have personal mobility devices like e-scooters as well, kick scooters. Then you also have personal assisted bikes. From a transport planning perspective, is there a need for so many classifications?
So, Lynda, I think to be honest, sometimes I get a little bit confused myself. Maybe let me try to break it down a little bit for you. So the most helpful way I like to think about this is to look at the design intention of the various devices. So take PMA, right? Personal mobility aids. So these are designed for people with mobility issues. So they are like wheelchairs but electrified. Okay, so they're a little bit heavier, usually have 4 wheels, go a bit slower. Okay, and they are used typically on footpaths or shared paths. Okay, so then we also have the PABs, the power-assisted bicycles. So basically, these are designed to be like bicycles. They are bicycles, but with the electric power assist. Now, you know that we know bicycles very well. They are old technology and there are lots of safety standards for bikes. So we know the characteristics of these bikes very well. So therefore, they are allowed on the roads, right? Because we know how they behave as a mechanical device. And then we have this entirely new breed of micro-mobility devices. And we lump them all together, we call them personal mobility devices. And so we have these electric scooters, the stand-up scooters, but we also have like Segway type devices.
And the scooters, some of them also come with seats.
Yeah, seats, without seats. So we have a lot of form factors. So in fact, they're all lumped together. But the problem is they could be very different in structure, in the geometry and the design from bicycles. So that's why they are usually not allowed on the roads to mix with heavier traffic, because we don't really know whether they are that safe to mix with heavier traffic like cars, motorcycles, higher speed. So that's basically the gist of why we have these different classifications.
And just now, instead of mentioning PBAs as
PABs.
power assisted bikes, I said personal assisted bikes, which adds on to this confusion as well. So there's so many classifications. You feel that we are over-regulating? And also, I also like to mention LTA also has another classification of the roads. We have shared paths, we have pedestrian-only paths, and then we have footpaths, and then we have roads. Is this too much regulation already? If we make these devices too difficult to use and the only comfortable alternative is buying a car, are we accidentally making mobility a luxury that only the rich can afford?
Yeah, I think that it could be quite overwhelming for somebody who just wants to use the device, right? So there's seems to be so many rules and so many types of paths and so on. But when we talk about PMAs, I think we need to acknowledge that some of the concerns are quite real. There are safety concerns on the footpaths because these PMAs, including mobility scooters, they're quite large and heavy, like the size of a golf cart buggy. And so you're running it on the paths and at a speed that is quite a lot higher than a walking speed. So there's a safety concern. And then there's a concern about a battery fire, especially when these devices are charged at home.
For the power-assisted bikes
for the PMAs.
PMAs
yeah.
as well.
And also the other type of electric PMDs, right? And also if you bring them into the lifts or onto the trains, right? So this concern of battery fire. And then there is also concern that if these devices become too common, right, would it cause even more congestion on already congested shared paths, shopping malls, the MRT stations?
But most of them are not allowed in shopping malls and indoor areas, right?
No, only the PMAs,
Okay.
mobility scooters, they are allowed. Okay. Also, there's this concern that, seeing able-bodied people riding mobility scooters may not be the kind of active lifestyle or active mobility lifestyle that the authorities want to promote, right? So I think that the various rules that we see are necessary. So we need standards, speed limits, certification, and enforcement. But if we stop there, I think we are only treating the symptoms. Okay, so the question, I think, is why are able-bodied people riding PMAs, right? Why not just use a faster bike or use a PMD or hop on a bus, right? So we need to look at the bigger question. And I think what some of these people that ride the PMAs, they are able-bodied, is they found a device that can fulfill their mobility needs. So they're filling a mobility gap in the transport needs that cannot be fulfilled by the other alternatives available.
PMAs or PMDs now? Because PMAs are motorized wheelchairs for people who are maybe above 70 and they need that. And also unless you have the certificate of medical need. So now it's PMDs that we are referring to.
I'm referring to PMAs. The mobility PMAs include the electric wheelchairs and also the mobility scooters, which are a bit bigger, but they have a kind of a steering in front. Able-bodied people without some kind of mobility needs and certification, they now cannot use these devices, but we still see them. So the question is,
you still see them, okay?
Using. So that's the concern, right? That's why there's a rule and. Okay, I think if you compare PMAs with other devices like PMDs, right, or PABs, like the bikes, right, there's a difference. And basically, there's three drivers for the demand to use these devices. One is that the technology itself have improved by leaps and bounds over the last 10 years. So you can now get these, let me call them micromobility devices, with a very good power, right? Relatively lightweight, with good range, and very affordable. Okay, so technology. And this is the big one, is the connectivity, right? So like with PMAs, mobility scooters, they are allowed on the footpaths, whereas all the other electric PMDs and PABs, they are not allowed on the footpaths. So that makes a big difference because it allows you to have a very good connectivity, right? So they can go from A to B pretty much everywhere except on the roads, right? But that's okay. So if you take a e-bike, for instance, like PAB, right? You can ride the e-bike on the road or on the shared paths. But the roads is busy, right? You have to mix with the heavy traffic. And our shared paths are, at the moment, they are quite disjointed. So not continuous. So you're forced to, if you want to go to another place, A to B, on the roads, then you'll be mixing with much faster traffic. So that's not very safe. And then PMDs, like the e-scooters, they are not even allowed on the road. So there is no connectivity for them. Okay. So it is a very appealing option to use a PMA. And also the third factor is that it has accessibility, which means that you don't need to use these devices for very long distances. But most of the trips actually in our towns are very short trips, less than 3 kilometers. So they're perfectly okay to use these devices. So that's why I think that the people, they want low-cost, convenient micromobility. And at the moment, there's really no other good connectivity options available. Okay, but if you look at the other cities like Beijing, which I visited recently, we hardly see anybody using PMAs or mobility scooters. So why? It's because they have managed to build up very good micromobility infrastructure, bike lanes. So unless you have some kind of a physical disability, you would be using an e-bikes and going quite fast on these dedicated micromobility lanes. So I think that the real solution is maybe not tighter rules, but a better system that offers alternative micromobility options for people so that they can use it for e-bikes and PMDs, and only the ones that truly need the PMAs will be using them.
So when you talk about PMAs just now, it sounds like there are still people who are using it illegally or against the new regulations. And also, but we also see how it also shows how this group, which most probably are gig workers, the delivery riders, they are actually using this type of vehicles or this type of devices.
The food delivery riders, they use PMAs, but not so many. So that's the concern there, right? But mainly they use bikes, PABs, electric bikes.
How about this disjointed paths we were talking about? Because now we actually have footpaths, pedestrian-only paths, cycling paths, shared paths, and roads. And PABs can only use cycling paths, shared paths, and roads. Is this a disjointed kind of infrastructure for them? And you've also mentioned just now that other cities like where you have been to Beijing and all that, I assume that they're actually quite smooth paths for such mobility devices to be used.
Yeah, so the infrastructure we have right now, we have bike paths, but actually the bike paths almost all of them are shared paths, right? So a lot of them actually are next to footpaths. And so these are now designated as many of them pedestrian-only paths, right? So you can't have bikes or e-bikes on it. But the shared paths are actually shared between all the PMDs, PABs, PMAs, and also the pedestrians. Okay, in Singapore, we don't have a lot of on-road dedicated paths yet, right? Unlike in some cities, yeah.
So, which also brings us to this friction about what we've seen, right? You brush against pedestrians, these sort of cyclists, food delivery riders, PMA riders. It's actually a bigger question about space, as we were discussing just now. Do you think Singapore efficiently uses its space for transport, especially since we've been on this journey to going on car-lite?
We are a small country, right? And we are very good with optimizing our living and working spaces. But when it comes to transport, I don't think we are quite there yet. We pride ourselves in being able to make use of limited resources. And the reason that we can be so compact is because we learn how to grow our city upward, right? By stacking our living and working spaces in high rises, right? Buildings, apartments, and so on. But the moment that we come to the ground, especially during peak hours, so we have these thousands of people all coming to the ground, vying for space on essentially a two-dimensional transport network. Okay, it's almost like spilling a glass of milk onto the floor. Right? So how do we move so many people through a limited amount of ground space? And this is where cars is a problem, because a car lane is fundamentally inefficient. So we have a metal box carrying one, maybe two people, and even at 30 kilometers per hour, it needs about 60 to 90 square meters of space. If you include the braking distance safe braking distance around the car. Okay, so think about that. That's about 6 to 9 times the average living space land plot footprint of a person living in high rise. Okay, so it's very space inefficient. So the question is, how do we reallocate some of this space to more efficient modes so that we can move more people? This is where we need a little bit of rebalancing our road space so that we can move more people instead of more cars. And so sometimes we get misled by what we see on the ground. Okay, if you look at towns, right, if you look closely, right, there are actually more people crossing the roads than cars that are driving along it. But because people take up so little space, right, compared to cars, it looks like an illusion that the cars are the majority. So you can 20 people waiting to cross a junction, a traffic junction, takes up very little space, maybe the size of a small tree. But you get 20 cars may lined up for a couple of 100 meters. And so it looks like visually they dominate the landscape, even though they actually are not the majority. Okay. So I think that when we talk about car-lite, right, so it's not just about people owning fewer cars or driving less. I think it should also be about car space light, right? So we should allocate more space for modes that are more space efficient so they can move more people, and less space for the more inefficient modes.
But cars are faster. I mean, we talk about economy and all that. Cars are faster. You want to move anything, you can move cars that are faster. Well, what is the impact this will have if we were to go with a car-like space? What's the impact on the economy, given that we likely going to move slower?
Yeah. So this is a very good question, because there's always a concern that if we take away car lanes, will we then make cars go very slow because it's very congested now, and then it will have a very negative impact on the economy. And so I think it's a fair question, and superficially on the surface it seems to make sense, right? Because if you take lanes away, then you're going to cause congestion. But I think we need to be careful that the economy depends on cars alone. Okay, so the core of the question is whether congestion will have a negative impact on the economy. In fact, a lot of studies have shown that it is impactful. Because you have streets that are very congested, then you slow down everything, things can't move, and time is money, right? So you lose time, you lose money, okay? Now, I'm not an economist, but congestion is also one of the favorite topics of traffic engineering. So there's a lot of research that has been done on congestion. So the question is, what is the cause of congestion, okay? And what's the solution, right? So if you look at congestion, it could be viewed as a case of supply and demand, right? So you have more demand, people who want to drive a car, and not enough supply, not enough roads, right? So then you think that, so you take away the road lanes, you're going to make things worse, okay? But there's also quite a lot of research that show that, in fact, congestion, you can never quite satisfy. It's a dynamic thing. Right, the more car lanes you put in to try to relieve congestion, for a while it works, but then the traffic will build up again. So you still have the same level of congestion. In fact, sometimes it might even worsen it. Okay, so it's a very well-known phenomenon in traffic engineering. It's called induced demand. And conversely, is people were afraid that if you take lanes away, then you could make congestion worse. But what turned out to be the case is if the city is designed well and there are alternatives where people can switch to other modes like public transit or the rail and so on, right? And then they will do a behavioral shift. So it's called a traffic evaporation. So it's not always the case that, just because we reallocate some lanes and then it will cause congestion, and then it might impact the economy. But talking about how it impacts the economy, right? So I want to share some figures on what are we moving on our roads, right? So if you look at Singapore, the total number of registered vehicles is about 1 million. And commercial vehicles like freight vehicles, trucks, and buses, they make up only 18% of total registered vehicle fleet, compared with cars, which is about 56%. So actually the commercial vehicles that deliver goods and services, vans and so on, they are 3 times fewer than cars. And car trips, in fact, 70% of the car trips are non-work and non-business related. They are personal trips. Not saying that they are non-essential, but that gives us a picture that perhaps the reason for our congestion is not so much that we are lacking in road space, but rather we are using our road inefficiently, because the cars is an inefficient mode of transport. So we can reduce the kind of trips that are not so essential, maybe using more efficient modes, then it could actually help the businesses, the deliveries, and so on, right? So you're going to lessen congestion, and that might actually improve the economy.
So you talked about car trips being 70% being non-work and non-business related. So it just goes to show that we can actually do with maybe a bit of more of active mobility in that sense. And do a minority actually drive? They do, right?
Yeah. So I think the statistics show that 1/3 of Singapore households own a car. And then if you look at just HDB households, it's even less. It's about, I think, a quarter only. So majority of the Singaporeans, they don't drive. They don't own a car. It's too expensive.
So given that the minority actually drive, why are we so hesitant to convert a car lane into a dedicated active mobility lane within HDB estates?
Okay, so who is hesitant or afraid of seeing some kind of road space reallocation to active modes, right? If you look at the residents in an estate, I don't think they would be hesitant. They probably will welcome it because they don't drive mostly. So they will welcome safer walking and cycling, probably. Now, the car owners, understandably, they'll be a little bit concerned because they fork out a lot of money for the cars, right? So they'll be concerned about convenience, impact on convenience, access to parking. And although they are a minority, right? Car drivers, they could be a vocal minority. But I think the people who are most, I wouldn't say hesitant, but cautious are the authorities, because they have to balance many competing needs, right? Bus operations, emergency access, deliveries, traffic flow, and public complaints, right? So any decision that is made to reallocate road space, say, might have system-wide consequences. So that's why I think that a lot of times they are very careful. And it's also why Singapore has largely adopted a different strategy for our bike lane infrastructure. Okay, so if you look at our bike lane infrastructure, they are mostly off-road, right? So they don't reclaim road space, so leaving the road space largely intact.
Right.
Okay.
The vehicle, roads for the vehicles.
Right.
Yeah, okay.
That's right. So this has achieved some success in towns, right? And so one indicator is that if you go to an MRT station, you now see in many places there are many bicycles parked there. Okay. So clearly, if you have some kind of a bike infrastructure, people are willing to use bicycle cycling. The problem with off-road shared paths is that often off-road space is even more congested and more limited than on-road space. Okay, so we might end up having shared paths that are disjointed, okay, and low capacity, it's narrow, and also they have to be shared with pedestrians, so posing a lot of conflict issues.
Okay,
so they might not provide the kind of a direct, connected, high-capacity network that we want to see if we want to see cycling and micromobility grow, right, as a serious mode of transport. So the long-term challenge is basically efficiency and safety. And so how do we get over this concern or hesitancy? I feel that we need a clear roadmap for micromobility and road space reallocation so that everybody can understand and support, right? So if people can understand the long-term vision, right, then the question will be less of what am I losing, right, when car space is taken away, and instead what we'll be gaining in terms of a safer infrastructure that is able to move more people and better connected. Many of our car lanes are quite wide, 3.5 meters. So why not? Is it possible to shrink the width a little bit, right? And which many cities do. You go to other cities, their lanes are not as wide generally. And that free up some space. So you can widen cycling paths or even footpaths, right? So, and the key is that we need a network that is continuous and high capacity, right? So then cycling can become an efficient mode of transport and micromobility as well.
And if we successfully integrate these devices as mainstream last mile solution, right, how much pressure would that relieve from our feeder bus networks during peak hours?
So I think quite significant. Let me explain a little bit. This is actually quite a technical question, right? So the advantages of micromobility is that they are able to absorb many of the short trips that are done by cars and also buses. Okay. The difference is that micromobility is a point-to-point mode of transport. Okay, just like cars. But buses are fixed route, right? So fixed routes means that you go from A to B, you go to walk to a bus stop, and then for every bus stop, it pauses, right? And they go, and then you have to walk to the last mile to your destination. The cars, they take up a lot of space. So cars are time efficient, but space inefficient. So micromobility has the best of both worlds. They are time efficient and also space efficient, right? So we actually did some simulations, computer simulation, how much you ask pressure, right, would they relieve from a feeder bus. We did some simulations, and it's interesting because we know that 1/3 of bus trips are actually 3 kilometers or less, right? And about half are under 4.5 kilometers. So distances are very short, bus trips. So they are actually the perfect kind of range for micromobility, okay? So in one scenario where we ran the simulation, let's say we have such good lanes, and so people want to cycle, use PMD e-bikes, and so on, right? So they would switch from bus to bikes, right? Let's assume, right, conservatively, that they will only switch if the cycling get them to their destination faster than the buses. And also, it doesn't take more than 10 minutes. Okay, so very, very reasonable. And even with such assumptions, we estimated that 25% of the bus trips will be shifted to cycling, right? So that's quite significant. And also, it will save about 4.5 minutes per converted trip. Now, if you think in economic terms, time is money, and we have millions of these bus trips that are converted per day, right? So annually, that amount to a value of about a few $100 million per year. So in terms of time savings, right, use a time value for money, right? So that's quite substantial. So with good integration, it does act as a pressure release valve for the feeder bus system so that it's not so congested, and then people who really need to use the bus system can use it because we provide the alternatives. So I think that the micromobility can act as not a competitor for the buses, but a booster, right? And if you walk to the bus stop or the MRT station, 10 minutes, 15 minutes, maybe if you live 1 kilometer away. But for the same time if you cycle, your range is 3 times. So your catchment areas around the bus stops or MRT station actually increases by 9 times. So that's a big boost.
But there's also a pushback most of the time when we talk about cycling from MRT station back home. It's very hot. How do you actually, is this argument valid, do you think? Or do electric devices fundamentally solve this sweat dilemma for the first and last mile?
Yeah, I think that's a very commonly heard argument, right? It's too hot and humid to cycle in Singapore. So if our idea of cycling as a mode of transport is we have to ride 15 kilometers to work in our work clothes every day, I think that unless you take this as a form of exercise or you enjoy sweating, right, it's not going to be a practical option for most people, right? But that's not what micromobility is for, actually. It's for the short trips. And in Singapore, actually, even car trips are quite short. The average car trip distance, median car trip distance is only 8 kilometers, right? And 30% of car trips are actually less than 5 kilometers. So, and then you have connectivity, first mile, last mile, right? So these are very short, definitely less than 2-3 kilometers. And this is where the micromobility is useful because with that kind of distance, and if you cycle even 12 kilometers per hour, you won't break a sweat, even on a mechanical bike, right? They will take you only 10 minutes or so.
Faster than walking.
Yeah, 3 times faster than walking, 2-3 times. And so walking, you will sweat. I think if you cycle that distance in that time, you probably will not sweat. And also with the electric micromobility, right, it will extend the range. So now we are actually able to maybe even cycle further or maybe even to work. I personally have cycled like 20, 30 kilometers on an e-bike in the afternoon and I don't sweat.
What about going indoors then to beat the weather, along with the micromobility devices that we were talking about? Right now, you have extensive underground networks like in Marina Bay, in Orchard. Will we ever reach a point where indoor infrastructure is built wide enough to safely separate pedestrians from people riding e-bikes and PMDs?
Yeah, that's a very interesting idea. It'd be cool if I can ride indoor, but I doubt that it will be very easy to implement because the whole point of micromobility is that it's energy efficient. And so if you have indoor underground infrastructure, right, for that, then what do we need? We need aircon, right? You need to use energy.
Okay, then we go up to the roads, right, about this future infrastructure, how it actually look like. We also talked about having some roads that are used for cycling, which actually LTA has experimented with at Tanah Merah, Coast Road, Seletar. And then we've also seen friendly streets. Are these trials giving us a preview of what dedicated micromobility lanes or PMAs might actually look like right next to the cars in our neighborhoods?
Yeah, possibly. And I see that also these designs keep improving. Okay, so in fact, these 2 examples you cited, they are very good examples because they serve different functions. So the TMCR, right, the Tanah Merah cycling route, is an example where it is on road. The cycling route is on road and is on a major arterial road, which means that we have multi-lane roads with high-speed, big vehicles, right? So you want it to be efficient and cyclists to be able to move also and cars also move. So that's why they have it on road and they separate them. Okay. And then on the other hand, you have the friendly streets. So these are low-speed neighborhoods, low-speed streets. So then what we see are the off-road cycling paths, which are mainly the shared paths. So I think they're all right if you can make them well-connected. And because they are low speed, right? So it's okay to share it with pedestrians. Everybody needs to be careful. And the main point is it helps you to cycle to the market, to the MRT stations, or so on. So the whole point is there's no single kind of design, right? So we need to look at the place, the streets, and the type of traffic flow.
So we already have these local experiments, right? What is the main psychological block stopping urban planners and the public from embracing this island-wide then?
One of the main psychological blocks, is that we see a lot of times road space as car space rather than public space. So when we think about, let's say, we want to relocate space for bikes, we often think about we're taking something away from drivers, right? This is a bit of a status quo bias and loss aversion, because now the roads feel very concrete and necessary, right? They're already built. And so we take it away, traffic will get worse. Whereas you think about what if you take it away and build the active mobility lanes, right? Most people won't think about the gains, right? That we will have better connected infrastructure, we moving people. So these are less visible. And the other thing is that there's a deep assumption that congestion is caused by a lack of road space. Whereas often congestion is caused by over-dependence on cars, right? So we talk about the induced demand just now, right? The solution actually is not to take space away from cars, is to rebalance and optimize our streets, right? So that we can move more people, as many people as possible, regardless of modes, right? So everybody needs mobility. So then maybe we'll end up with infrastructure that is truly connected and more equitable, that everybody have good access to transport. Yeah.
What's the clear roadmap for micromobility then, bearing all these in mind? Which cities should we look for best practices? Do they actually have a clear roadmap for micromobility, apart from infrastructure building?
There are many cities that we can learn from, but probably there is no one-size-fits-all solution, because every city is different, and we probably best is to learn good lessons from each one. Okay, so for example, London, right? So London pioneered the low traffic neighborhood, where they show how you can reclaim street space from cars and make it safer for kids and the elderly, so vulnerable pedestrians. And then we have Paris and New York. So I think the main lessons from there is actually political will.
But they're also quite big. As in, they're larger than Singapore in terms.
Yeah, they're big cities.
The city itself is already many times larger. So how do we actually justify that?
Paris and New York, they are big cities, but they saw a need for because they have terrible congestion previously. So how do they solve that congestion problem? Right, things get stuck, and it's not just loss of time, but it also affects living quality and pollution, air quality, and so on. So the solution is to have more space-efficient modes, public transport, right, buses, and also cycling, right? So they rebuilt it. So the books that written about it is quite interesting how its leadership was able to push through the programs in very short time, about 10 years. And now many parts of the city have been transformed. So there's a lesson in political will there. And then you have Asian cities like Beijing, right? So what they're showing us is that electric two-wheelers can be a mainstream form of mobility.
But they have so much space.
Okay, so it looks like so, right? So because China is much bigger than Singapore, but we are talking about cities, right? So cities are very dense by definition.
What do you mean by dense?
Dense is the population density, right? The number of people per square meters. And these cities, they are not any less dense than Singapore. Take Tokyo and Osaka. They are basically giant metropolises, right? And very dense, but they have great public transport buses, and also their cycling mode share is very high, 15 to 25%. Why is that? Because they recognize the need for more space-efficient modes, right, in a dense city, right? And I think that's where cars has a bit of a sustainability problem, because they are fundamentally very space inefficient. Now, Singapore has actually quite a different urban form. So we can't actually copy and paste wholesale from what there. Singapore, if you look at our street road network design, it has what we call a polycentric structure, meaning that if you want to go from A to B, along the way you have to take a major arterial road, which is very wide, multi-lane, okay, relatively high speed. Okay, so Whereas in, let's say, European cities, right, a lot of their street design are grid-like, right? So you from A to B, you can always find a quieter street or as an alternative route for which you can build a bike lane. So in Singapore, it's a little bit different, right? So we have to be a bit careful when we look at our street relocation design. We have to think about the impact, right, on overall traffic. But the thing that we can learn, I think, is that the good news is that we are not starting from a weak position because we already have excellent roads, right? We have excellent public transport and we have nice cars, right? Nice vehicles. You know that our roads are good enough for Formula One, right? So the question is, can we make our roads also good for pedestrians, cyclists, and other vulnerable road users, right? The approach that we need to learn from cities is the discipline, right, of the approach, which is actually grounded in something called the safe system approach. Right? And it underlies the design of the so-called complete streets, where you have all modes traveling along the street, right? Or sometimes they call it the AAA infrastructure. That means infrastructure for all ages and abilities. So what this means is, in practical terms, is that they recognize that the human makes mistakes. And so we want a more forgiving kind of street layouts, so that even if you make mistakes, you have a crash, then the outcome might not be so severe. Okay, so there may be lower speeds on shared spaces, and then on arterial roads where you have a high speed, really need to move cars and vehicles, then you might have a separate lanes for different modes, and then safer intersections, because intersections are where most of the conflicts happen, right? So what would we see if we implement this, right? So I think tomorrow I would like to see that we'll have streets that have less conflict, right? Are more connected.
More relaxed driving.
More relaxed, less stressful. And then micromobility becomes one of the practical alternative modes of transport option.
So the space is there. It's just a matter of who we choose to give it to. Associate Professor Yap Fook Fah, thank you very much for coming into the studio and sharing your insights with us.
Thank you, Lynda.
Well, that's a wrap for In Your Opinion. I'm Lynda Hong. You can email us your thoughts on this issue. Also, if you'd like to read ST articles or opinion columns, these links can be found in our podcast show notes. This episode is edited by Hadiu Rahim. Thanks for listening.
Send your feedback to podcast@sph.com.sg. Find us on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or within our Straits Times app. Thanks for listening.